Two 17-year-old girls walked out of a pub called The World's End. Their bodies turned up the next day. It took Scotland 37 years to convict the man responsible. A serial killer murdered entire families in their sleep, then represented himself at trial, and nearly got away with it. And a woman was killed by a man the police had identified within the first month. His superiors told them to back off. He kept attacking women for 17 more years. This is the dark side of Scotland. On October 15th, 1977, two 17-year-old girls walked into a pub in Edinburgh. Their names were Christine Eady and Helen Scott. They were best friends. That night they were celebrating. They'd just landed their first jobs. It was the last stop on a pub crawl through the city's historic center. The pub was called The World's End. The next morning, their bodies were found out in the countryside, several miles apart from each other. They'd been tied up, beaten, raided, and strangled with their own clothing. It took Scotland 37 years to convict the man responsible. Edinburgh in 1977 still felt like a safe city. Girls went out at night. They hopped from pub to pub. They took conversations from strangers because that's just how social life worked in a city where every Saturday night the center filled up with people. Christine and Helen weren't being reckless. They were young, they were celebrating, and they trusted two men who came up to them in the pub with the ease of people who had done this before. One of those men was Angus Sinclair. He was 31 years old, a house painter, married, had kids, and he had a criminal record that, had it been handled differently by the system, would have kept him behind bars long before Christine and Helen ever walked through the door of the World's End. Because Angus Sinclair had killed before. Over the following years, he was convicted of rape and sexual assault against children. Back to prison. Out again. The system processed him, convicted him, released him, and in October of 1977, Angus Sinclair was free, married to a woman named Sarah Hamilton, and that night he went out with his brother-in-law, Gordon Hamilton, to the center of Edinburgh. At the World's End, they approached Christine and Helen. Nobody knows exactly what they said to them. Nobody knows how they convinced them to leave with them, but the pub's cameras, primitive by today's standards, but there caught them walking out with the two men just before closing time. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. The next morning, a farmer found Christine Eady's body at Gosford Bay, Aberlady, about 18 miles east of Edinburgh. She'd been bound with her own clothing, raped and strangled. Hours later, Helen Scott's body was found in a field near Haddington, several miles from where Christine lay. Same pattern, same marks, the same calculated brutality. The investigation that followed was one of the largest in Scottish police history. They interviewed over 3,000 people, went through thousands of records, plastered posters all over the city asking for information. Nothing. For almost 20 years, the case went unsolved. Christine and Helen became part of Edinburgh's dark folklore, the girls from the pub at the end of the world, whose killer had never faced justice. In 1995, the world of crime changed. DNA became a standard tool in criminal investigations across the UK, and Scottish police started revisiting cold cases with the new technology. Angus Sinclair, who by that point was already serving a life sentence for the murder of Mary Gallagher and for a string of sexual assaults against minors, was contacted. Police asked him for a voluntary DNA sample. He gave it, no pushback, completely calm about it. Years later, when investigators analyzed the preserved DNA samples from Christine and Helen's case, they found a match. And then another one, a second man's DNA on Helen's clothing. That profile took several more years to identify, but it eventually matched Gordon Hamilton, Sinclair's brother-in-law, who had died of liver cirrhosis in 1996. The two men who killed Christine and Helen, one dead, the other in prison for other crimes. Police were convinced they had the DNA. They had fibers from Sinclair's car matching fibers found on the bodies. They had years of accumulated forensic work. They brought the case to trial in 2007. And then something happened that Scotland never forgot. The 2007 trial collapsed. The judge, Lord Clark, ruled that the evidence presented by the prosecution was insufficient and pulled the case from the jury before they could deliberate. In legal terms, that was the equivalent of an acquittal, and under Scottish law and most legal systems in the world, that meant Angus Sinclair could not be tried again for the same crimes. The principle of double jeopardy protected him. The parents of Christine and Helen, who had spent 30 years waiting for justice, watched as the man every investigator believed was responsible walked out of the courtroom without a conviction. Sinclair, from the courtroom floor, smiled, but Scotland wasn't going to let it go. The collapse of the 2007 trial created enormous public and political pressure to reform the double jeopardy law. How could it be possible that a man acquitted due to insufficient evidence couldn't be tried again if new conclusive evidence came to light? In 2011, Scotland changed the law. The Double Jeopardy Scotland Act allowed that, under exceptional circumstances, including the emergence of new evidence, someone who had been acquitted could be brought to trial again. Angus Sinclair was the reason that law existed, and he was the first person to be tried under it. The second trial began in October 2014. It lasted 5 weeks. The prosecution presented the DNA, the car fibers, the forensic analysis of the wounds, and Sinclair's pattern of behavior across decades. The jury deliberated for 2.5 hours. On November 14, 2014, 37 years after the deaths of Christine and Helen, Angus Sinclair was found guilty of their murders. The sentence was the longest ever handed down by a Scottish court, a minimum of 37 years in prison, meaning that to even be eligible for parole, Sinclair would have had to live to the age of 106. He didn't make it that far. He died at Glenacle Prison on March 11, 2019. He was 73 years old. That same day, the BBC program Crime Watch Roadshow aired a profile of the world's end crimes. The timing wasn't lost on anyone. But there's something else about Angus Sinclair's story that goes beyond the World's End murders. Scottish police believe Sinclair killed at least 6 more women, all in Scotland, all throughout the 70s and 80s. He was never formally charged for those deaths. In some cases, the evidence wasn't enough. In others, the bodies were never found. Those victims don't have a verdict. Their families don't have closure. And Gordon Hamilton, the brother-in-law, the second man whose DNA was on Helen's body, was never tried. He died in 1996 before the evidence pointed to him. He never answered for what he did that night in 1977. Christine Eady and Helen Scott were 17 years old. They'd just landed their first jobs. They were out celebrating the start of their adult lives. They went out for a few drinks and never came home. And the man who killed them spent decades sitting in the same prison cells of the very system that had once set him free, waiting for enough time to pass so the world would forget. He almost pulled it off. Our next case also comes from Scotland. It also involves a man the system released too early. It also involves families who waited decades for justice. But Peter Manuel operated before DNA existed, before security cameras existed, and at a time when a killer could move between cities, murdering entire families without anyone connecting the dots. They called him the Beast of Birkenshaw, and he represented himself at trial with a brilliance that terrified the courtroom. In the last case, we talked about a system that released a killer multiple times before he murdered Christine and Helen. A system that took 37 years to convict him. Our next case goes back 20 years before that. A Scotland with no DNA, no security cameras, none of the forensic tools we take for granted today, and a man who murdered entire families in their beds, who ate the breakfast of a family he had just slaughtered, who gave a police officer a ride and told him where they were looking in the wrong place for a victim's body, and who, at trial, decided to fire his lawyers and represent himself. His name was Peter Manuel, and Scotland called him the Beast of Birkenshaw. Peter Thomas Anthony Manuel was born on March 13th, 1927 in New York City. His parents were Scottish. They'd emigrated to the United States looking for a better life. When the Great Depression hit America, they moved back to Scotland and settled in Birkenshaw, a small town in Lanarkshire, southeast of Glasgow. Peter grew up as a different kind of kid, not in the poetic sense, in the kind that worries people. He was a loner, a bully, someone who from a very young age found ways to break the rules. By 11, he already had a record for theft. By 16, he had attacked and raped several women. He spent years bouncing in and out of juvenile institutions, prisons, rehabilitation programs that rehabilitated absolutely nothing. In 1953, Manuel settled in Glasgow with his family. He was 26 years old. He had an extensive criminal record, and he had a deep, unshakable conviction that he was smarter than anyone in any room. That conviction would kill him, but first it would kill others. On January 2nd, 1956, Anne Kenealans was 17 years old, and walking alone at night in East Kilbride when Manuel attacked her. He beat her repeatedly with an iron bar. He raped her. He killed her. Lanarkshire police brought him in for questioning. He was a known sex offender in the area. His father gave him an alibi. There wasn't enough evidence. They let him go. Manuel killed again. In September 1956, he broke into the home of the Watt family in Burnside. Marion Watt, 45, her daughter Vivienne, 16, and Marion's sister-in-law, Margaret Brown, 41. He killed all 3 of them in their sleep. shooting them in the head. Marion's husband, William Watt, was away traveling at the time. Police arrested him, convinced he was the one responsible. He spent 67 days in prison for crimes he didn't commit. Manuel was still out there. Throughout 1957, he kept killing. In December, Isabel Cook, 17 years old, on her way to a dance, vanished. Police searched for her body for weeks and found nothing. Her clothes turned up in different locations, but that was it. On January 1st, 1958, New Year's Eve, Hogmanay in Scotland, the killer broke into the Smart family home in Uddingston. Peter Smart was 45, his wife Doris, 42, their son Michael, 10. He killed all three of them in their sleep. Shots to the head. None of them had time to react. None of them suffered. They just stopped existing on the most festive night of the Scottish year. And then Manuel did something that perfectly defines who he was. He stayed. For almost a week, Manuel lived inside the home of the family he had just massacred. He ate their food. He fed the family cat, putting out a saucer of milk for it every single morning. He slept in their beds. He drove their car. And at some point, he opened the cupboard and helped himself to a bowl of the child's breakfast cereal. There's something about that image. The killer sitting at a dead family's table, eating a 10-year-old boy's cereal while that boy lay dead upstairs, that captures Manuel's psychology better than any clinical analysis ever could. When he finally left the Smart family's house, Manuel took money from Peter's wallet, freshly issued banknotes, easily traceable, and drove off in the family's car. On his way back to Glasgow, he picked up a hitchhiker. The hitchhiker was an off-duty police officer named Robert Smith. The two men chatted during the ride. At some point, Smith brought up the disappearance of Isabel Cook and the ongoing search efforts. Manuel calmly told him the police were looking in the wrong place. He was right. He knew exactly where Isabel Cook was because he had killed her and buried her there himself. On January 14th, 1958, police finally made their move. They had traced the stolen banknotes from Peter Smart's wallet back to Manuel. They went to the family home in Birkenshaw and arrested Manuel's father, a calculated move. It worked. Peter Manuel turned himself in voluntarily. He said they'd release his father if he talked. And he talked. He confessed to 18 murders. He was only tried for 8. The ones there was enough evidence to prosecute. And during the trial, he did something that left the courtroom and the Scottish press absolutely stunned. Midway through the proceedings, he fired his lawyers and decided to represent himself. What followed was one of the most extraordinary trials in Scottish legal history. Manuel, with no legal training, no formal preparation whatsoever, cross-examined witnesses, presented arguments, challenged forensic evidence, and attempted to build a defense that cast off his responsibility for several of the crimes. His intelligence was genuine. His ability to manipulate language and narrative was real. At one point, he led investigators out to the field where he had buried Isabel Cook. He walked across the uneven ground, looked down, and said, "I'm standing on her right now." He was right. Judge Lord Cameron watched him for weeks and arrived at a conclusion that went down in Scottish legal history. Manuel was very wicked without being mad. He wasn't a sick man who didn't understand what he was doing. He was someone who understood perfectly and did it anyway. The jury deliberated for 2.5 hours. Peter Manuel was found guilty of 7 murders. He was sentenced to death. On July 11th, 1958, Peter Manuel was taken to the gallows at Barlinnie Prison in Glasgow. He was 31 years old. He was the second to last man hanged at that prison, and the third to last person executed in all of Scotland. 7 years after his death, Great Britain abolished the death penalty. His last words, directed at the executioner as the noose was placed around his neck, were, "Turn up the radio and I'll go quietly." Quiet until the very end. With that same cold detachment he'd had eating cereal in a dead family's kitchen. With that same distance that had allowed him to sit next to a police officer and casually discuss a victim he himself had buried. Peter Manuel confessed to 18 murders. He was tried for 8, convicted of 7. What happened to the other 10? Some cases never had enough evidence to go to trial. Some bodies were never found. One murder in England was attributed to him after his death, when the investigation connected it to him retroactively. William Watt, Marion's husband, who had spent 67 days in prison for Manuel's crimes, was released. He didn't receive a formal apology from the Scottish state for decades. And the family of Anne Connelans, the first victim, the 17-year-old attacked with the iron bar, never got a verdict. Manuel confessed to killing her. One of Anne's shoes was found in his possession, but the evidence wasn't considered sufficient to include her in the charges at trial. Justice has jagged edges, and sometimes the ones most affected are the ones left outside those edges. Our last case today also involves a victim the system took far too long to see. It also involves an investigation that dragged on for decades. and it also ends with a killer who had been killing long before anyone connected the dots. But the Emma Caldwell case has something Manuel and Sinclair don't. A conviction that came in 2024, almost 20 years after the crime, and a scandal over how Scottish police tried to pin the blame on the wrong person while the real killer stayed free. I'm talking about Emma Caldwell. On April 4th, 2005, Emma Caldwell was seen for the last time on a security camera in the south of Glasgow. It was 11 o'clock at night. She was walking alone down Butterbiggins Road. Emma was 27 years old. She'd grown up in a loving family in Glasgow. She was close to her parents, William and Margaret, and to her sister. But her life had taken a dark turn years earlier when her sister died. The grief was too much. Emma started using heroin to numb it, and to fund that habit, she worked as a sex worker on the streets of South Glasgow. Her mother, Margaret, knew. She accepted it. She kept loving her. She kept calling her. She kept hoping that someday Emma would be able to break out of that cycle. That April night was the last time anyone saw her. On May 8th, 2005, 5 weeks after her disappearance, Emma's body was found in Limefield Woods, a remote, isolated forest near Biggar in South Lanarkshire, about 40 miles southeast of Glasgow. She was naked. She had been strangled with both hands and a cable. Her clothes, her phone, and her personal belongings were gone. Someone had deliberately discarded them to make the investigation harder. Strathclyde police, who handled the area at the time, opened an investigation called Operation Grail, and within the first few weeks, the detectives in charge identified a suspect. His name was Ian Packer. Packer was 32 in 2005. He was well known in the circles where women like Emma worked. He'd sought them out, used their services, and several had reported that he was violent, aggressive, that he'd drive them out to isolated areas, that he'd do things that terrified them. The profile fit perfectly with what had happened to Emma, someone who knew her from that world, who had a car, who had taken her to a remote forest. 4 detectives from Operation Grail said publicly, years later, that they had been convinced of Packer's guilt from the very beginning. One of them, retired Detective Willie Mason, said it flat out. "I was 100% certain it was him." But their superiors told them to drop it. Instead, the investigation went in a completely different direction. In 2007, 2 years after the murder, police arrested 4 Turkish men who had been in contact with Emma in the days before her disappearance. They charged them with her murder. They took them to court. The case collapsed. All 4 men were acquitted. Police had spent £4 million sterling building a case against innocent men. Meanwhile, Ian Packer was still walking free, and he kept attacking women. After the investigation's focus shifted away from him, Packer committed at least 19 additional sexual assaults against women. 19. Women who were raped, beaten, terrorized, while the man who should have been behind bars was still on the street because someone up the chain of command had decided he wasn't the right suspect. Retired Detective Mason was unequivocal when he spoke publicly. "They gave Ian Packer a license to continue his violence against women. They caused one of the worst injustices I have ever witnessed in my career." Emma Caldwell's case went unsolved for a decade. Her parents, William and Margaret, kept demanding answers, kept pushing. William Caldwell died without ever seeing justice for his daughter. In 2015, Scotland's Lord Advocate, the country's chief prosecutor, ordered the newly formed Police Scotland to reinvestigate the case from scratch. Not just Emma's murder, but the failures of the original investigation. And in 2018, BBC Scotland did something that changed the course of the case. The investigative program Disclosure sent a journalist, Sam Poling, to interview Ian Packer. She interviewed him twice. Packer talked, and what he said and the way he said it was enough to accelerate the reinvestigation. In 2022, 17 years after Emma's murder, Ian Packer was arrested and formally charged with her killing. The trial began in January 2024 at the High Court of Glasgow. What the jury heard over the following weeks was devastating. More than 20 women testified about what Ian Packer had done to them. They described how he had picked them up, driven them to isolated areas, threatened them, beaten them, raided them. One after another, they painted a picture of systematic violence, stretching back years. The prosecution presented 17 lines of circumstantial evidence. None of them a direct eyewitness to Emma's murder, but together they formed a portrait that was impossible to ignore. The jury was physically taken to Limefield Woods so they could see for themselves the place where Emma was found, the distance from the road, the isolation, how deliberate the choice of location had been. On February 28, 2024, nearly 19 years after Emma's death, The jury deliberated and delivered its verdict. Guilty. Ian Packer was found guilty of the murder of Emma Caldwell and 33 additional counts of physical and sexual violence against 22 women, including 11 rapes. The sentence was life in prison with a minimum of 36 years before he could apply for parole. Judge Lord Beckett told him directly, "Your actions have had terrible and lasting consequences for your victims." Emma's mother, Margaret Caldwell, spoke to BBC Scotland after the verdict. She said she could breathe again, and then she said something else. Something the Scottish system still hasn't fully come to terms with. Margaret believes police officers deliberately sabotaged the investigation into Packer for a decade. They have blood on their hands. For too long they have remained in the shadows, but now they must answer for their betrayal. Those aren't the words of someone who's simply grieving. Those are the words of someone who spent 19 years reading documents, listening to testimony, understanding exactly what happened, and the evidence backs her up. In June 2024, the Scottish government ordered a public judicial inquiry, chaired by Judge Lord Scott, to examine exactly how and why police ignored the signs pointing to Packer from the very beginning. That inquiry is still ongoing. There's something about the Emma Caldwell case that goes beyond the horror of the crime itself. It's the question of why police went in a completely different direction. The 4 detectives who identified Packer from the very beginning say their superiors deliberately shut them down. That when they pointed to the evidence, they were told no. That the investigation was redirected toward the Turkish men for reasons that were never satisfactorily explained. Was it incompetence? Was it bias? A preference for building a case against foreign men, rather than investigating someone closer to that world? Was it something worse? The public inquiry is going to try to answer those questions. But what we already know is this. While Scottish police were spending £4 million prosecuting innocent men, Ian Packer was still out there attacking women. Women who reported him. Women who gave their statements. Women the system ignored in exactly the same way it had ignored Emma. Emma Caldwell was 27 years old. Her mother Margaret is still alive to see her killer convicted. Her father William didn't make it. Ian Packer will be 87 years old before he can apply for parole. And the public inquiry that will determine exactly what went wrong and who is responsible still has no end date. That's Scotland. 3 cases. 3 different ways the system failed its victims. 2 teenagers who walked out of a pub called The World's End, whose killer smiled in the courtroom for 37 years before being convicted. A family murderer who convinced the justice system he was smarter than all of them, and he was almost right. And a woman whose killer was identified by police within the first few weeks, ignored for a decade, and who kept attacking women while the system looked the other way. Which case hit you the hardest? And what country do you want me to cover in my next video? See you soon!